The entire town stepped back from her at the exact moment the cowboy stepped forward. Yet neither of them seemed to notice the horse charging straight through the square. The rope snapped with a sharp crack across the frozen street. Snow swirled between frightened townsfolk as a young girl tumbled across the icy ground. A suitcase lay open beside the stranger nobody wanted, books scattered in the slush. Then the cowboy's eyes locked on hers for the first time, and the crowd suddenly went quiet. What happened next would follow them all the way to Cedar Ridge Ranch. If you're enjoying the story so far, tell us where you're watching from. Winter arrived early in Silver Creek. The first snow had settled along the edges of the road, turning the ruts left by wagon wheels into frozen ribbons beneath the pale Colorado sun. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Horses stood tied outside the general store with frost gathering on their backs. The stagecoach rolled into town just after noon. Most people barely glanced at it. Travelers came and went often enough. But one woman stepped down carrying a worn leather suitcase and a bundle of books tied together with a faded strap. She paused beside the coach, pulling her coat tighter against the mountain wind. Her name was Vivian Brooks, 25 years old, tired from the journey and completely alone. She thanked the driver, picked up her belongings, and walked toward the center of town. The general store was her first stop. The owner listened politely while she asked if he needed help stocking shelves or keeping records. He shook his head. The dress shop turned her away before she finished speaking. The diner owner said business was slow. By late afternoon, Vivian had heard enough refusals to stop expecting anything else. She stood in the town square with cold fingers wrapped around the handle of her suitcase. That was when Eleanor Briggs saw her. The widow was stepping out of the post office when she stopped so suddenly that the man behind her nearly collided with her shoulder. Her eyes narrowed. "I know you." Several people nearby looked up. Vivian's expression barely changed. Eleanor stepped closer. "I've seen you before, Kansas." The square grew quieter. Vivian lowered her eyes for a moment. That was all Eleanor needed. "I knew it," she said loudly. "You're that woman from the school fire." Conversations stopped. A blacksmith paused with a horseshoe in his hand. Two ranch hands looked over from outside the saloon. Eleanor's voice carried across the square. People lost everything because of that fire. Nobody asked questions. Nobody asked if it was true. The word spread faster than smoke. Within minutes, doors seemed to close without being touched. The boarding house owner suddenly had no vacancies. A shopkeeper who had smiled earlier avoided her gaze. A few younger cowboys laughed among themselves. Vivian stood still through all of it. Snowflakes drifted across her coat. Her grip tightened slightly around the suitcase handle. Nothing more. Across the street, a tall cowboy leaned against a post outside the feed store. Caleb Turner watched without speaking. Then a scream cut through the square. A young horse burst from the auction pen. People jumped aside. The animal kicked wildly as it raced down the street. A little girl was tangled in the trailing rope behind it. She hit the frozen ground hard. The crowd gasped. No one moved. The horse was too fast, too dangerous. Vivian dropped her suitcase. Before anyone realized what she was doing, she ran straight toward the animal. Her boots slipped on the icy road. She caught the rope for a second, lost it, then lunged again. A small folding knife flashed from her pocket. One quick movement, the rope snapped. The girl rolled free just as the horse thundered past. The square fell silent. Vivian knelt beside the child, checking her breathing. The little girl's eyes opened. She was frightened but unharmed. A shadow fell across them. Vivian looked up. The cowboy from the feed store stood there. Snow drifted across the shoulders of his coat. He glanced at the girl, then at Vivian. "The boarding house turn you away?" Vivian hesitated. "Seems most places have." Caleb nodded once. The little girl reached for his hand. Only then did Vivian realize who she was. His niece, the child she had just saved. Caleb looked toward the gathering crowd. Then back at her, his voice was calm, steady, as if the decision had already been made. I've got a spare room. And for the first time since stepping into Silver Creek, Vivian Brooks didn't feel entirely alone. The ride to Cedar Ridge Ranch took nearly 40 minutes. The road wound north through snow-covered pastureland and stands of pine that darkened against the evening sky. The cold had sharpened. Every breath drifted white into the fading light. Vivian sat behind Caleb Turner on the wagon seat, her suitcase resting between her boots. Neither of them spoke much. The little girl she had saved sat bundled beneath a wool blanket. Her name, Vivian learned, was Lucy. Every now and then, Lucy glanced at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When the ranch finally appeared, it rose from the white landscape, like something that had been standing there forever. A large cedar gate, long fences stretching toward the hills, a weathered barn. A two-story ranch house with warm light glowing behind a few windows. But even from a distance, something about it felt quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place after laughter has been gone a long time. Caleb carried her suitcase inside. The spare room sat at the back of the house near the kitchen. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a small iron stove, and a single window looking toward the horse pasture. "It's yours as long as you need it," Caleb said. Vivian looked around. She had slept in worse places, far worse. "Thank you." He nodded once and left her alone. No questions, no demands, no curiosity, only kindness that surprised her more than anything. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. The habit had followed her from town to town. She dressed quietly and stepped into the kitchen. The house was still dark. A coffee pot sat on the stove. A stack of dishes rested beside the sink. The room looked organized, but only barely, like a place being maintained rather than lived in. Vivian rolled up her sleeves. By the time Caleb came in from feeding horses, biscuits were baking. Coffee steamed from 3 mugs. Lucy was already sitting at the table. The little girl looked delighted. Caleb paused near the doorway. For a second, he simply stood there, watching. Then he removed his gloves. "Smells good." It wasn't much, but somehow it sounded like more. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Snow fell. Sun returned, then snow again. Vivian repaired several torn schoolbooks she found packed away in a storage chest. Lucy began carrying them around the house. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes she stumbled over words and laughed at herself. The sound felt strange inside the old ranch, as if the walls were remembering something. Vivian also spent time in the barn. One horse carried an old leg injury. Another had a saddle sore that needed cleaning. She worked carefully, patiently. The animals responded to her. Caleb noticed. He noticed everything. The way she returned tools to the same hook, the way she folded blankets, the way she never wasted food. One evening he came inside to find his old winter coat hanging by the stove. A torn seam beneath the sleeve had been repaired, perfectly. He ran a thumb across the stitching, then glanced toward the kitchen. Vivian was kneading bread. She never mentioned the coat. He never asked. Still, the next morning he left fresh firewood stacked outside her room. Neither of them spoke about that either. By the second week, Lucy had started following Vivian everywhere, to the barn, to the pantry, even to the mailbox at the road. One afternoon they returned carrying letters. Lucy raced inside first. Vivian sorted through the stack behind her. Then she froze. A single envelope remained in her hand. Kansas. The return address had been smudged by weather, but she recognized it immediately. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, she didn't move. The winter wind rattled the porch railing. Behind her, the front door opened. Caleb stepped outside carrying a feed ledger. He stopped when he saw her, saw the letter, saw the way her hand tightened around it. Neither spoke. The silence stretched. Then Vivian slipped the envelope into her coat pocket. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. She forced a small nod. "Just old business. Caleb studied her for a moment, not pressing, not prying, but noticing, always noticing. The wind blew harder across the valley. Somewhere beyond the ranch, dark clouds gathered over the mountains. And for the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge Ranch, the past had found Vivian Brooks again. She waited until everyone had gone to bed before opening the letter. The lamp on the small table cast a soft circle of light across the room. Wind tapped against the window pane. The ranch house creaked the way old houses do in winter. The letter was short. A man named Samuel Pierce had written it. Someone had started asking questions again in Kansas. Old records had been pulled from storage. Old names had resurfaced. One name appeared more than once. Walter Grayson. Vivian folded the letter carefully. Then she sat for a long time without moving. The next morning she tucked the envelope into her coat pocket and carried on as if nothing had changed. But rumors move faster than snowmelt in a small town. Within a week, people began whispering again. A mother who usually waved to Vivian at church looked away. Two boys who often stopped by the ranch to borrow books suddenly stopped coming. At Miller's General Store, conversations paused when she entered. Nobody said anything directly. That somehow felt worse. One Sunday morning, Vivian and Lucy arrived at the church just as the bell stopped ringing. The pastor met them at the door. His hat remained in his hands. His eyes stayed on the ground. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Some of the families are uncomfortable." Lucy frowned. Vivian understood immediately. She gave the pastor a small nod, then turned around without argument. The church doors closed behind them. The sound followed them, all the way back to the wagon. That evening, Caleb found a folded cancellation notice on his desk. A cattle shipment contract. Canceled. 2 days later, another ranch withdrew from a breeding agreement. Then another. Walter Grayson never appeared personally. He didn't need to. His influence traveled for him. The pressure settled over Cedar Ridge Ranch like fresh snow. Quiet, heavy, relentless. One night, Vivian packed her suitcase. Not much had to go inside. A few dresses, a Bible, the same books she had carried into Silver Creek. She placed them carefully in order. The bedroom door opened. Caleb stood there. Neither spoke at first. His eyes moved from the suitcase to her face, then back again. Vivian lowered her gaze. "I won't stay here and ruin what you've built." Caleb stepped into the room. He didn't argue. Didn't tell her she was wrong. Instead, he reached into his pocket. He placed a small brass key on the dresser. The key to her room. Then he walked out. Nothing else. No speech, no explanation. Just the key. Vivian stared at it, long after he was gone. Later that night, she found him sitting alone at the kitchen table. A coffee cup sat untouched beside him. Snow drifted past the window. For the first time, she told him everything. The school, the fire, the children, the desperate hours spent carrying them outside, the businessmen who had wanted the land beneath the schoolhouse, the lies that followed. When she finished, the house fell silent. Caleb looked down at the letter from Kansas she had finally shown him. His eyes narrowed at a familiar name, Walter Grayson, not the man responsible, but connected closely enough to make Caleb sit very still. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the ranch house. Inside, neither of them realized it yet. But the truth had finally begun moving toward Silver Creek. Winter tightened its grip during the first week of January. Snow piled against fence posts. The creek behind the north pasture froze solid. Ranchers started talking about an old storm pattern moving down from Wyoming. By Thursday, the sky had turned the color of iron. Caleb spent the morning helping neighboring ranches move cattle from higher ground. The weather was changing too fast to ignore. Lucy begged to come along. At first, Caleb refused. Then he gave in on the condition that she stay close to the wagons. Vivian watched them leave from the porch. Something about the wind unsettled her. By noon, the first snow arrived. Not gentle flakes, sharp snow driven sideways. The kind that erased roads and landmarks within minutes. An hour later, one of Caleb's ranch hands came riding hard through the gate. His horse was covered in frost. "Lucy's gone." The words hit the yard like a gunshot. The cattle had scattered near Black Ridge. In the confusion, nobody had seen where the girl went. Vivian was already pulling on her coat. Caleb saddled another horse. Neither wasted time speaking. The storm swallowed sound almost immediately. Snow stung their faces. The mountain trail disappeared beneath fresh drifts. They searched until daylight began fading. At every rise, they called Lucy's name. Only the wind answered. Then Vivian spotted something. A small red scarf caught on a pine branch. Lucy's scarf. The trail led higher, toward an abandoned trapping cabin near the ridge. The door was half buried in snow. Vivian forced it open. Inside, curled beneath an old blanket, was Lucy, cold, terrified, alive. The girl burst into tears the moment she saw her. Vivian wrapped her in every blanket she could find. Then she removed her own coat and draped it around Lucy's shoulders. The temperature kept falling. Minutes felt like hours. When Caleb finally reached the cabin, relief crossed his face. So quickly, it was almost painful to witness. He dropped beside Lucy first. Then he looked at Vivian. She was sitting against the wall now, shivering, her hands pale, her eyes struggling to stay open. For the first time since she had known him, Caleb lost the calm control he carried everywhere. "Vivian." He crossed the room immediately. She tried to stand, couldn't. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in his heavy coat and lifted her into his arms. The ride back to Cedar Ridge Ranch happened in darkness and blowing snow. Lucy rode ahead with one of the ranch hands. Caleb never loosened his hold on Vivian. Not once. For 3 days afterward, she drifted in and out of fever. The doctor from a neighboring valley came through the storm to check on her. Lucy rarely left the bedroom. Caleb barely left it either. Coffee cups gathered on the bedside table. The lamp burned through long winter nights. Sometimes Vivian woke to find him reading quietly near the stove. Sometimes she woke to find him simply sitting there, watching the fire, waiting. On the 4th morning, another rider arrived from Kansas. The man carried a leather document case wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were court records, witness statements, signed affidavits, evidence buried for years, evidence proving Vivian Brooks had never caused the school fire. As the snow continued falling outside, the truth finally arrived at Cedar Ridge Ranch. The documents remained on Caleb's kitchen table for 3 days. Not because he doubted them, because roads were still blocked and half the county was trapped behind snowdrifts taller than fence rails. When the weather finally broke, Silver Creek began moving again. Wagons returned to the roads. The church bell rang on Sunday. Smoke rose from chimneys across town, and word spread that there would be a public meeting at the church. Nearly everyone came: farmers, store owners, ranch hands. Families who had spent months repeating rumors they had never bothered to question. Vivian almost didn't attend. She stood in her room that morning, staring at the same suitcase she had carried into town weeks earlier. Caleb knocked softly. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." She looked at him. "Maybe not." After a moment she added, "But the truth deserves one." The church filled quickly. Walter Grayson arrived wearing his best coat and the confident expression of a man accustomed to controlling a room. That confidence lasted less than an hour. The man from Kansas stood before the congregation and opened the document case. One record after another. Witness statements, insurance filings, property agreements, names, dates, signatures, facts. The school fire had not been caused by Vivian Brooks. The investigation had found that years ago. The findings had simply disappeared afterward. The businessman responsible had planned to acquire the school property. Walter Grayson had helped bury evidence because of his financial ties to the project. A silence settled across the church. Not the comfortable kind, the heavy kind, the kind people sit with when they realize they were wrong. Eleanor Briggs stared at the floor. The pastor removed his glasses. Several mothers looked toward Vivian. No one seemed quite sure what to say. Walter tried speaking once, then again. Neither attempt helped him. By the time the meeting ended, his reputation had suffered the same fate he had once hoped for Vivian's. Outside, snow reflected bright afternoon sunlight. People gathered in small groups. A few approached Vivian. Some offered apologies. Others simply tipped their hats. She accepted both with equal grace. But when the crowd finally drifted away, she felt strangely unsettled. That evening, she returned to Cedar Ridge Ranch, opened her closet, and began packing, not because she had been forced out. For the first time in years, nobody was forcing her anywhere. That was the problem. The choice was finally hers. Late the next afternoon, Caleb asked her to take a ride. They followed a trail behind the ranch that climbed toward a low ridge overlooking the valley. Snow covered the fields below. Silver Creek rested quietly in the distance. The mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Caleb stopped near the top. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he handed her a key. Not the key to the spare room, a different key. Vivian frowned. "What is this?" Caleb pointed toward a small building farther down the hill. Fresh lumber, new windows, a simple front porch. Beside it stood a larger unfinished structure. "The schoolhouse?" Caleb nodded. "You always look at it when we pass." Vivian's eyes filled. She couldn't help it. For weeks she had talked about books, children, learning, dreams she had stopped allowing herself to have. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, suddenly looking less comfortable than he ever had facing a blizzard. The spare room was never meant to be permanent. His voice was quiet, steady. Then he looked directly at her. "You were." The wind moved softly across the ridge. Somewhere below, a horse called from the pasture. Vivian laughed through tears she could no longer stop. The first tears Caleb had ever seen her shed. Months later, spring arrived. Snow melted from the valley. Wildflowers appeared beside the creek. The schoolhouse opened its doors. Children filled the room with noise and questions and muddy boots. A bell rang over Silver Creek for the first day of class. Caleb stood on the porch watching. Lucy ran down the path carrying books against her chest. Vivian stepped into the sunlight behind her. For a moment, the three of them stood together, not by accident, not out of necessity, by choice. The woman who had arrived unwanted had become part of the town's future. The cowboy who had spent years living inside silence finally had a family again. And Cedar Ridge Ranch no longer felt like the house that had forgotten how to laugh. It remembered every day. And maybe that's what stayed with me most about Vivian's story. Not the storm, not the rumors, not even the moment the truth finally came to light. It was the simple fact that a person can spend years carrying a wound no one else can see, and still choose kindness when the world gives them every reason not to. Imagine standing where Vivian once stood, a stranger in a town that had already made up its mind about you. Imagine wondering if every door would close before you ever had the chance to explain yourself. Then imagine finding one person who looks past the noise, the gossip, and the mistakes others have pinned to your name. Sometimes healing begins that quietly. A spare room, a place at the table, a hand that stays when leaving would be easier. Stories like this remind us that second chances rarely arrive with fanfare. More often they arrive disguised as ordinary moments. A conversation, a kindness, a person willing to believe there is more to your story than what others say. And maybe the greatest kind of love isn't finding someone who rescues you. Maybe it's finding someone who helps you remember that you were never lost in the first place. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the longest. And if you enjoy stories about hope, healing, family, and the unexpected roads that lead people home, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more stories waiting just beyond the next trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you.